everyone, and welcome to Life Cycle Talks, a series of talks presenting the research front to keep you up to date with the science and the application of the life cycle perspective. Today's Life Cycle Talks is How are psychological barriers and motivations shaping consumer behavior, where we will learn about how to combine psychological assessment with LCA methodology. My name is Maria Rydberg, and I'm happy to welcome our guest for today, Erik Klint, who is a senior researcher at Narsus. Before we start, I will just give you some brief practical information. All Life Cycle Talks will be published and made available on the Swedish Life Cycle Center YouTube channel after we have ended this live event. We will not use the raise hand function during Life Cycle Talks, but feel free to submit any questions that you have using the Q&A function. We will select a few of these to address during the Q&A session after Erik has presented. Talking about questions, I want to start with a warm-up question for you, Erik. I am a bit curious, what motivated you to begin exploring this area of research?
Yeah, that's a pretty good question. And for me, I think that the main motivation was not necessarily, if I'm going to be completely honest, not necessarily the life cycle assessment perspective on consumption and consumables, but rather the psychological aspect. What motivates us to do certain things or to make certain decisions, and how will this affect environmental impacts? So for me, I rather come from the psychological perspective first, and then apply the life cycle analysis perspective or methodology.
Thank you for that answer. It's really interesting. Now, Erik, welcome, and it's time for your life cycle talk.
Thank you. Well, hello. My name is Erik Klint, and as Maria already mentioned, I currently work as a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Sustainability Research, NORSUS. During my years of working with LCA, I've noticed a peculiar pattern when it comes to environmental impacts from consumable and consumption. And I know that most of you already know what I'm talking about. We as consumers say one thing, but later act completely different. We claim that tackling climate change is super important to us. And then we take our family for a weekend across the globe, buy a new TV, even though we already have one, and celebrate an accomplishment with an all-you-can-eat barbecue buffet. At the same time, we as LCA practitioners often act that this is a problem of information. Well, we need to inform the people so we can make them take the right decisions. Or, if that's not possible, well, it's not that the LCA is wrong, it's just that people are irrational. There's nothing we can do about that. I don't believe that. I don't believe that people are irrational. Instead, I believe that it is we as researchers who fail to properly understand the underlying consumer logic, especially when it comes to goal conflicts. And I think that this challenge becomes quite obvious if we take a look at how we define the functional unit for LCAs targeting consumer behaviors and consumables. So let us start with an example. What is the functional unit of a t-shirt? A recent review of LCA data for clothing showed that the most frequently used functional unit of a t-shirt was either a certain amount of material, like a kilo of cotton or polyester, or a use frequency, the daily use over a year, for example. And both of these makes complete sense when we are analyzing how to produce t-shirts. We want to optimize for resources, or we want to optimize for potential use. But what about the consumer perspective? Do you wake up in the morning thinking, oh, it would be really nice to consume a kilo of cotton today using my clothes? Of course not. Yet this is actually what we implicitly assume if we come with policy recommendations that target consumer behavior based on these LCAs. And don't get me wrong, many of these LCAs are very well made. They are super advanced and brilliantly performed and rely on really good data. It's just that they mainly focus on the technical aspect of the t-shirt. Or to make the example even more clear, would you consider wearing these two t-shirts the same? I would argue that although they are made from the same material and offer the same type of daily wears, they offer different symbolical meaning. And this has consequences. So how can we start including this social perspective rather than just focus on the technical one? What it has helped me over the years is to shift from solely relying on objective measurements of performance to also think about the experienced value from using the product or service. In other words, to apply design thinking when defining the functional unit. Additionally, I think that it is helpful to separate between the type of value we experience when we consume and the source of our motivation. Now, experienced value can either be physical, that is something that we can interact with in the real world, or it can be symbolical. It mainly exists in our collective belief system, things that specify in our culture or how we interpret the world. Motivation, on the other hand, can either be extrinsic, that is, the motivation comes from interacting with the real world, something outside ourselves, or it can be intrinsic. It comes from within and focused on ourselves. And I know, of course, this is a very rough categorization, yet I hope that you will find it as useful as I have when trying to think about functional unit for life cycle assessment of consumables and consumption. So let's start with the first row. When the motivations comes from interacting with the outside world, the source of motivation is extrinsic. If it's the physical object that we interact with, this is the classical example. What we think about when we think about life cycle assessments of consumable is either rooted in economical or functional utility. We buy something because it allows us to do new stuff, or we think that it has a good price. The function of a car is to transport me from A to B. Hence, the functional unit becomes person kilometers. However, the second we move over to the symbolic aspects of experienced value, things change. And this type of rationale has more to do with us showing off. It's about virtue signaling. Look how well I'm doing. I have a Ferrari. And look how beautiful this thing is that I created or bought. So the function of the car is not no longer getting from A to B, is to brag about how successful we are and to make our neighbor jealous. The second row has more to do with ourselves because the motivation comes from within and experienced within. So for the physical stuff, this is the classical way of new experience of the feeling good about yourself, self-fulfillment. Whereas the symbolical stuff is more aimed at what many philosophers would say the things that makes us human. Is the spiritual, the ethical, moral, or what identify us as a species or as individuals. And of course, once again, this is not a complete picture, and many types of consumption falls into several categories at the same time. That being said, it can still be helpful when trying to include a social perspective in LCA, because if we can identify the main motivation and the main experience value, we can understand the underlying psychological drivers and barriers for changing that behavior. So let's take an example, so how we can use this in practice. Let's look at domestic laundering. Cleaning our clothes in our home, our everyday clothes, using a washing machine in our apartment or in our home. And these type of LCAs are not something new, and there are several good analyses out there. We have a washing machine, and the function of the washing machine is to convert the dirty clothes to clean ones. And in this process, it requires energy and resources and leads to environmental impact. In this system, this very simplified system, the functional unit is often defined as something like a kilo of laundry washed and dry. We take a kilo, how much emissions can be tied per kilo laundry that is the output from the washing machine when we run it. And the result from these types of analysis are often very sound advice on how to limit environmental impacts. You should fill up the machine, you should wash in colder temperatures, use less detergent, and perhaps use wash fewer times. Yet if we look at consumer behavior, we don't seem to care, and we wash our clothes more frequently every year. Why? Let's look what happens if we apply a design perspective. The first question is, okay, what's the value of doing the laundry? Well, we want to have access to clean clothes. Okay, but what's the value of the clothes being clean? Can't we have dirty clothes? Sometimes perhaps, but generally in everyday situations, no. Because if my shirt has stains or sweat, other people might judge me and I would feel embarrassed. So doing the laundry ensures that I avoid feeling embarrassment. I've done what I can in order to minimize that risk. And suddenly our function is not necessarily then cleaning 1 kilo of laundry, but rather feeling secure in social situations or feeling confident in social situations with respect to clothing cleanliness. And we can now reverse the question in order to understand the social perspective of laundering better. So if it's true that we clean our clothes to feel secure in social situations, are there any additional requirements that needs to be fulfilled to reduce the risk of embarrassment with respect to clothing cleanliness? Well, yes. First of all, they should be clean given the social situation, but they should also be relatively free of wear and tear. They should have no persistent stains or hole. And finally, we need the right type of clothes in terms of style, in terms of function, in terms of physical fit. Much like the old Bridget Jones movie where they cancel the masquerade theme, but they don't inform all the guests. There's an embarrassment of showing up to the party dressed as a mascot where everybody else had normal party clothes on. So how will we as consumers behave then if these conditions, these requirements are not met? Well, for the first off, if they're not clean, we will run the washing machine. If they are wear and tear, if they hold, we replace them. And if we don't have the right type or if it's not the right physical fit, we will buy new clothes or buy more clothes. So should this be included then in an LCA of laundering? What of these requirements can be affected by laundering and thus should be included within the system boundary? Because the initial scope is looking at laundering from an LCA perspective. Cleaning, yes. Wear and tear, yes. Washing clothes, damage them. And partly of the right type would need to be included as well, because it can alter the physical fit. So in other words, from a technical perspective, laundering is solely about running the machine. But from a social perspective, we also need to include the replacement rate of clothes. The problem is that it's not all type of consumption that should be included, only the isolated consumption of clothes that is motivated by cleanliness reasons. And that type of data is much harder to acquire. Not impossible, but harder. And I believe that that type of data is necessary if we actually want to increase our potential to alter consumer behaviors for laundering. And I think this example nicely illustrates the novel challenge when analyzing consumer products from a social perspective. Because if we go back to the motivation value matrix, if we can call that, we can see that initially our example mainly viewed laundering as a functional utility. Upper left corner in this matrix. We use the machine to clean the clothes. It offers us a new function. But as we shifted our perspective, we soon realized that, well, laundering is more about feeling socially secure, feeling confident in social situation, because clean clothes signal something in society. And this places the consumption in the upper right corner. And this is often an alternative explanation to why people are so reluctant to change behavior, because all the initiatives and the policy recommendations are targeting the functional utility. So rather than being irrational, washing at colder temperatures, filling up the machine, is optimizing for technical function, not virtue signaling. So in other words, policy recommendations miss the underlying rationale for consumption, and people don't care. So what to do instead then? Well, if we can accept this, we can understand, we can look deeper into what part of the consumption can we affect that has to do with virtue signaling. And for our case, this was disgust, because disgust affect how we view cleanliness. And it turns out that this affect both the turnover rate of clothing, so that people that are more disgust sensitive buy clothes more often, all else being equal, as well as wash those clothes more often, all else being equal. So we use the psychological perspective as a common denominator. However, if this is possible in real life, and how to test for this will have to be another life cycle talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erik, for your life cycle talk. Now we will have a Q&A session, and please post your questions in the Q&A function. I will start with a question from my side. When you did this research, Erik, what surprised you the most?
I think what surprised me the most was this detachment between doing the analysis in one way, yet for some consumables and some consumption, we intuitively understand how irrational this type of analysis was. It's irrational to talk about laundering from just a solid technical perspective. I think most of us can agree to that. We can understand that if we have a presentation, a life cycle talk, and somebody mentions, well, you have sweat stains on your shirt the whole time, it becomes an embarrassment. And then in order to minimize that risk, I will wash more and more and more. And it doesn't really matter if you say, well, have you thought about the environment? Yeah, but it's a goal conflict between the environment and the feelings of being socially secure. And in that case, I think that the socially secure argument will always win.
Sounds reasonable, I think, from my side at least. But why do you believe that we struggle to incorporate social aspects into LCA studies?
I don't know. It perhaps has to do with many things. I mean, as I understand it, the life cycle methodology and the theory connected to it has, from a historical point of view, been targeting production route, supply chain management, understanding production facilities, and that type of things that lead to environmental impacts. And now we're ready or beginning to look much more broadly. And then, of course, if you have a tradition steeped in focusing on the technical aspect, you tend to adapt. It can be harder to adapt for the social perspective if your history is the technical one. We need outside help, so to speak.
I understand. But do you have any practical recommendations for those of us and those who are listening, who you could work with LCA and you want to explore the social aspects further?
I think that a good way to start is to, as always, to read up on these alternative perspectives, perhaps use this matrix to explore these alternative motivations and experienced value in what motivates or the rationale for consumption. But then I think we as a LCA community should reach out to other professions, sociology, psychology, to understand more what the meaning people ascribe to the consumable and to the consumption, rather than just focusing on measurable, quantified technical stuff.
Now we'll start picking up questions from the Q&A function. And the first one that we will pick up is, what would be a functional unit considering the psychological dimension?
That's a very good question. I think for me, what I'm starting to explore is to what extent can we say that the function and the functional unit is not the same thing. So, for example, in the ISO standard, it specifies that the functional units should be quantified or quantifiable, measurable. And I think that one first step is trying to explore whether or not this is necessarily true in all situations. So, for example, in the laundry situation, and where we found that the discuss sensitivity was determining how often, or could influence how often you wash and how often you replace your clothes. The function or the functional unit in this case would not necessarily be a measurement of more or less. It could be binary. It could be feeling secure in social situations. That's the function. And then, of course, how do you measure that? That's a big challenge, of course. And that's, but that's the part of research, to explore these new frontiers. But I don't think we necessarily need to have a number in it. It could be either I feel secure or I don't. And what will I do if I don't feel secure? And then we adapt the system boundary and the cases that we explore according to that dynamic.
There's a question that is within the same area. How can we start measuring this virtue signaling or vanity function? Would it be a case of socio-psychological indicators that SLCA currently don't cover?
It feels like it was two parts of that question.
Maybe,
so I
yes.
think if we try to target psychological aspect and how to measure psychological aspects, I mean, that's the whole field of psychology to a large extent, and consumer psychology and pricing psychology and utility psychology. There's a lot of different people that already do this type of research. So it's a mere question of collaborating with them. In the terms of SLCA, of social life cycle assessment, that, as I interpret it, because I haven't done any social life cycle assessment, that has more to do about the social implication of society, democratic aspects, child labor, and looking into those things from an still a technical point of view. So rather that it's the impact assessment, the indicators that will be affected from in a social system, rather than that the object of our analysis is a social behavior. So I think that is potentially possible, but you need to split those two.
Thank you. Let's switch a little bit perspective here on the questions. I'm also interested in how this translates to policy enforcing consumer behavior. For example, what people do with textiles at the end of life: throw away, donate, keep in the house unused. How would you suggest to include that into the functional unit or into the system boundary?
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. I think the question is, someone wants to know how to translate this into the policy that are enforcing consumer behavior. How could that be included in the functional unit or the system boundary? in somehow.
I don't necessarily know how the policy recommendations should be included into the functional unit or the system boundary, but as a consequence of doing this analysis, I think that the policy recommendations and the initiatives or recommendations for shaping consumer behavior must target other types of initiatives. So, for example, if we talk about laundry once more, because that's what I've been doing research on, there's perhaps little use to demand people or demand the system that it should offer more secondhand clothing, because a lot of people feel reluctant using secondhand clothing, not necessarily for logical reason, but just the feelings of disgust. I don't want to. I want the new stuff. I don't want used stuff. And then it becomes like, it doesn't really matter if you have a policy that says, well, we should grow the secondhand market, because people won't buy it, because they are not motivated by that. In that case, it's better than to focus on the motivation and try to target, help people to overcome this, because it's often irrational fear of being judged. Or in terms of cleanliness, sometimes we clean it as a risk mitigation strategy. We put it in the washing machine. When in doubt, wash the clothes. But sometimes it might be useful to just air them out, or to switch between a set of clothes. Because if we think about it, as we live, at least in most modern societies, our clothes doesn't become dirty. So the function of doing the washing might even be that it delays the usage of that item later on, so that others don't interpret us as using the same clothes every day over and over. And in that case, well, you don't really need to wash them. It's just delaying action that we need to target. To say, like, you switch between two sets of clothes. You use some clothes and then you put them back in the wardrobe without washing them, and then use them 3 days later. Nobody will notice, because the clothes are clean to begin with, but you already introduced this time delay, which you want to achieve with washing them rather than cleaning them.
Sounds reasonable, I think. I have one final question. How would you try to impact consumers to change their laundering behavior to reduce this fear of social impacts?
I think, well, first off, I think that people are quite keen on changing their behavior, but they are either consciously or unconsciously guided by this fear of being judged, or that somebody should comment on this. So I would suggest, if you want to try this, as I think many will do, try to challenge yourself into altering without washing, for example, airing out and then using again. And I mean, you could offer people a rationale, an excuse to do this behavior. Because if you're not offering an excuse, it's sort of falls back on you. Why you do this? Are you weird? It's like, no. You can say, I'm in a research study with the Erik Klint. I would never do this. Usually I wash it after every time. But now, since I'm in a research study, I try to see if and usually people don't comment. I mean, the studies that have done this, but the rationale, offering an excuse to try this behavior is often necessary in order to try the new behavior. And once you try the new behavior, you realize nobody cares, nobody noticed, because everybody was so focused on their own clothes that they didn't realize that you didn't wash yours.
Thank you very much, Erik. Thank you so much for your life cycle talk. It was really interesting to listen to. And now we are at the end of this talk. I will just say thank you everybody for listening. And if you're interested to know more about Erik's field of research, these links or publications is a good start. And all that is listed on this slide can also be found on the Swedish Life Cycle Center website, which you find in the calendar event for this talk. And all life cycle talks are made available at the YouTube channel, and they are published by the Innovation Cluster for the Life Cycle Perspective and Swedish Life Cycle Center. Thank you so much for listening. Our next Life Cycle talk will be in October. And if you don't want to miss it, please follow Swedish Life Cycle Center on LinkedIn and feel free to subscribe to our newsletter to keep you up to date with Life Cycle talks and our other event and information.